and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to escalate. More than 18,400 Palestinians have been killed, according to Gaza health officials, and aid to the enclave has largely stopped, with the UN and other international organizations warning about mass starvation amid ongoing Israeli bombardment. Mina Al-Oraibi, editor of the UAE's national newspaper, has just returned from the front line of the humanitarian crisis at the Rafah crossing in Egypt, where she travelled with UN officials to get a first-hand look at the crisis on the ground. Mina now joins me live for more on this. And Mina, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your reporting. As I just said, you went to Rafah. It's the only crossing for aid into Gaza, and it struck me because upon returning, you wrote that the conversations now over political horizons and plans just seem so distant from the dire realities on the ground there. So what struck you the most about this trip to the border, and what did some of your reporting reveal? Good morning.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you for having me on. The trip highlighted what we know to be a desperate situation, but highlighted to what extent Gaza truly is choked. Nothing can come in or come out. Very few of the wounded are actually allowed to evacuate to get out to Egypt. Some are then taken to third countries, including the UAE, but also Turkey and others that have offered to receive some of the wounded Palestinians. In terms of aid, as you said, the situation is desperate. 80% of the population of Gaza, at a minimum, is now displaced. 1 million of Gaza's 2.5 million inhabitants live in UN schools or hospitals. They're not in their homes. Winter is setting in. Many are living in tents. And when you go to the crossing, you see thousands, no exaggeration, thousands of trucks lining the streets all the way back into Al Arish, waiting to be allowed in. So the aid, while not enough, is actually there. It's just not allowed to go in. Israel checks everything that goes in. It's a very slow and arduous process. The Israeli authorities say they don't want anything to come in that could help Hamas. And yet the reality is you see diapers, you see dates, basic sustenance for people that's just not coming in. At the same time, you see ambulances, again, lining the streets, waiting to evacuate some of the injured. The situation in Gaza, especially when it comes to healthcare, is terrible, not just because of the wounded, and there are thousands of them, but also the lack of water, which means very poor sanitation. You have babies and children under 5s not having clean drinking water, means that death is a reality for them. In addition to, of course, as I said, winter is setting in. The situation really is desperate. We were there with the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, but also importantly, we were there with ambassadors from countries of the UN Security Council. The UAE organized this trip. The UAE is still on the UN Security Council. Its term will end in January. However, it's been actively working to make sure that there's action at the UN Security Council to allow for humanitarian assistance. And as you said, you really get a sense that the political discussions are so far away from the very desperate reality of we need water, we need basic food to come in, and also to help treat the wounded. The UN Security Council envoys that were there, all the members of the UN Security Council at the moment were there, except for the US, France, and Gabon. They did not join the trip. But the rest of the envoys that were there, it was apparent, it was so clear on their faces how they were realizing the reality, and it was setting in of how a lack of action on the international stage leading to very dire consequences.
Indeed, Mina, and even you said that, in your travels with Lana Nusseibeh, that the humanitarian aid process is clearly not working in the absence of a ceasefire. I want your reaction to the latest political wranglings on this as well, because President Biden has been talking a little tougher about Israel, but of course the US is continuing to support Israel and its war effort. He signed off on $100 million in new war support. And of course, as you've been reporting, the US vetoed the UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. So why do you believe that President Biden's suddenly renewed criticism on Israel isn't translating into concrete action when it comes to addressing the humanitarian crisis and finding a new pathway for a ceasefire here?
Ultimately, the US using its veto 3 times now, just in this war, to stop calls for a ceasefire, has given a sense to the Israeli government that it is okay to continue with this war in the manner that they are conducting it. I think the point is people are saying they understand what Israel's security concerns are, but nothing can really justify the level of destruction and humanitarian suffering. And I believe there's been such pressure on President Biden internationally. It's clear that there is a consensus globally that this needs to change. 153 countries in the UN General Assembly voted in favor of a resolution for a ceasefire. It's non-binding because of course, the US has the all-important veto on the UN Security Council. President Biden is also facing internal opposition. State Department clearly has many diplomats that have written cables of dissent, but also his own constituency. We know that 18 to 34-year-old Democrats are very unhappy with how the US has handled this war. So I think he has both a domestic and an international constituency that he needs to start answering to.